We have two guests joining us in the studio this morning. We want to talk about the state of human rights in Africa. So they are from Human Rights Watch. One of them is Karine Kaneza Nantulia. She is the Deputy Director for Africa. And Otsieno Namwaya is the Director for East Africa. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning to you.
Sana.
Asante.
I've recently learned you have to not say good morning, lady, and good morning, people.
Yes.
We're okay with ladies and
Okay,
gentlemen.
good. You just can never be too sure. Thank you very much for joining us in Kenya's biggest conversation. And we want to talk about the state of human rights. Of course, I know that you periodically release a human rights report. And is a new one out?
Let me just explain a bit. The what is out is what we normally call the annual report. The annual report is basically an overview of what we have covered over the year, the previous year. But in the course of the year, we usually have fresh reports that include fresh investigations and commentaries. So the report that we have now is basically an overview of the work that we have done over the year across Africa.
Okay. So let's begin with what is Human Rights Watch? What is the organization? And when you talk about the Human Rights Watch in Africa, what is the job that Human Rights Watch does in Africa?
Human Rights Watch is an international NGO. Our work is to document human rights violations and abuses across the continent, not the continent, but across the world. We work in close to 100 countries across the world, including Kenya, where we have an office. And Kenya is basically a hub for East and Central and the Horn. And we also do advocacy once we release those kind of reports to bring governments on board and to help make the government see the reason to change or address the abuses.
So is it that you document the abuses, or do you also look at progress being made by states in advancing human rights?
That's part of the advocacy strategy and initiatives that the organization takes. For instance, in Africa, we are working in approximately 25 countries. We have a staff of about 33 people. And in order to push for recommendations on our recommendations that emerge from the research that our teams carry out, we have to look at where the gaps are. And those gaps are obviously defined by the progress and lack thereof, obviously. So, yeah.
Okay. I often, these conversations, when we talk about the state of human rights on the continent and then look at specific countries, we often see that there are those who are flagged for then having not, if there's a standard that has been set, many then have not met. So what is the footprint, or what does it look like right now? What is the state of human rights according to the work that has been done over the last 12 months, per se, over the last 24 months, over the last 3 years? What does it look like? Have things improved? Have things gotten better? Is there still a clarion call for, human rights to then be regarded more by governments and people today?
I think the clarion call remains. I think in 2023, we look at an image that is mixed. There has been some progress, especially when you look at when you think of progress on justice matters and justice processes. We have countries like in Central African Republic, where there's a special criminal court that has recently indicted 3 members of a rebel group for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in 2019. You have countries like Guinea, where there has been now proceedings, official proceedings, on what has been known as the Stadium Massacre of 2009. So those are positive steps taken by some governments obviously in partnership with their partners, with international partners. However, having said that, we also see a rise in violent extremism. We see a rise in crackdowns against protesters, peaceful protesters, journalists, political opponents in different parts of the continent. And on the other hand, you also have regional mechanisms and regional processes that some governments have taken, and Kenya is actually one of them, in trying to tackle and address humanitarian and human rights crisis. A good example is obviously the increasing insecurity caused by the Rwanda-backed M23 rebel group in Eastern Congo, and Kenya is actually part of a regional initiative in trying to address that insecurity. You have, at the same time, there is a rise in disinformation and misinformation. I think you, as a journalist, you can see it, I think, on social media, where you have an even a rise in hate speech, right? So it's a mixed picture. It's really a mixed picture where, for an organization like ours, the question arises in terms of where are we going to focus? What are our priorities? We work on civil and political rights. We work on economic, social, and cultural rights. But we also look at issues affecting different constituencies, like women's rights, refugee rights, etc. Namwaya.
On the issue of what are the standards, the international standards, like the International Declaration on Human Rights and the covenants on human rights, which basically guide our assessment of the human rights situation in each country. Because we look at many countries outside of Africa and within Africa, the national law matters, but the national law also has to be in line with the international standards of human rights. In terms of the situation right now, normally it's difficult to talk in terms of whether the situation is getting worse or increasing or getting better. But we have serious concerns with the situation of human rights in Africa today. One is that there are a lot of human rights abuses, both in conflict situations like Ethiopia today or South Sudan to some extent, maybe Congo, but also in non-conflict situations like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, those kind of countries, where accountability itself is a challenge. So the abuses happen, some of them or a lot of them, by state agencies, say police, and the authorities are made aware of this. Some of those reports that have been brought to the attention of the police of the authorities are not just by Human Rights Watch, but some of them are done by state agencies themselves, like Kenya National Commission on Human Rights here, or the Uganda National Commission on Human Rights, or even the UN agencies. But once that is done, to some extent acknowledged, we don't see steps to investigate or ensure accountability for those abuses. We could discuss the details of some of the abuses.
What are some of those concerns? What are the concerns that we're talking about here?
No, go ahead.
Okay. They vary. If we go, for example, in Kenya here, we have the issue of police, extrajudicial killings here, which have been on the cards for as long as I remember. The difference in Kenya is that we have at least institutions like IPOA, which ordinarily should ensure accountability. I think the challenge we have had is that IPOA has tended to go for the low-hanging fruits, but not the really politically sensitive cases, like the 2017 killings during elections, the killings and disappearances around terrorism. But we also have countries like Uganda, where we have had people being disappeared from 2019. They're picked up in what the Ugandans call drones, basically a Toyota Hiace van, which is unmarked. You can't tell who is who. Sometimes they come in uniform, sometimes they don't come in uniform. And these people are taken to places that are unknown. Sometimes some of them who have come out have said they were taken to an island in Lake Victoria. And the numbers we are talking about are worrying. I think in 2020 and early 2021, just before the elections, people were quoting figures like 600 people have disappeared within 1 year. Initially, we thought this was linked to the elections, but then since after the elections, I think the disappearances have continued. Like in November, I think we had 5 people again picked up, and 3 have not been found, 2 have been released. One of them was actually a former presidential candidate. And that's how serious it is. In June, I think our team met President Museveni and brought these issues up. And he promised to ensure that there is investigation and follow up to ensure that some of those who have been implicated are taken into account. And the people who are being implicated are senior military staff, military officers, senior police officers, some who are known publicly. But since then, nothing has happened. And you can talk about that across Africa. If you go to South Sudan, for example, you are all aware of the war situation that has been in South Sudan since 2013. There was a peace deal in 2018. There were milestones that were supposed to be met, which included ensuring accountability for the killings that happened during that civil war. And that included setting up what was called a hybrid court. We are coming to the end of that 5-year peace deal this year in February, and the hybrid court is not in place. There was supposed to be unification of the forces, the opposition force and the government forces. That hasn't happened. There was supposed to be elections after that. I don't think the situation on the ground right now allows for the elections, because there is even a possibility that we could have a breakout of another civil war within South Sudan. So the killings have happened, the attacks going on, but there has been no appetite on the part of the government to even try and investigate, even where they had the ability to do it.
You know, I have around 3 questions I want to ask, and I'm trying to figure out how to ask it so that it's a question. Let me start by asking, how do you go about guaranteeing that your reporting is balanced? Maybe I can explain to you why I'm asking that question. Because I was looking at East African, and there's an article that, there's a snippet of a gentleman by the name of Kenneth Roth. Okay? Now, Kenneth Roth, according to this article, it's a snippet. He said that a long-time head of the Human Rights Watch had his Harvard Fellowship offer rescinded because of the organization's criticism of Israeli policies, according to a U.S. publication. The U.S. publication is called The Sun, but it doesn't just stop there. There were criticism back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and people saying this gentleman is against the Jews, other people coming in and saying something contrary. Now, they then attach it to a program he had within Harvard that was withdrawn, and it's being stated that the reason why it was withdrawn was because of the position that he and Human Rights Watch took. Now, if I bring the situation back to, say, East and Central Africa, I look at the atrocities that are committed by either security forces at the behest of politicians and all the wrongdoings that fly in the face of any human rights position that one can take. And I sometimes am forced to ask this question: who are the real victims here? Because we think the people who are jailed, taken to that island, are the victims. But I'm looking at the Kenyan police service, and I'm looking at the officers, and I'm looking at the conditions under which they work, and the things that are perhaps demanded of them. Well, I'm asking both of you. So at some point, I'm forced to ask that question, and that's where the balance comes in. Who is the real victim here?
And I'm going to answer, I think, highlighting some aspects of our work, and then I'll let Namwaya to complete with your question on Kenya, your specific question on Kenya. I think, how do you ensure that your investigation, our research, the research is balanced, impartial? The answer is twofold. First one is we document abuses committed by government forces and non-governmental forces, all parties. On the as a side topic, the article you mentioned about Ken Roth, suffice to say that Human Rights Watch has been on record documenting abuses committed by both sides. We would just like to invite anyone to go on our website and look at our reports over the years on abuses committed by the Palestinian authorities. So that's the first, I think, the first part of our work. The other part is that who gives us the mandate and on whose behalf do we do our research and our advocacy? And the answer is very simple. It's really the victims. Our work, the research that our colleagues do, they interview the victims, the witnesses of these abuses, and we also give an opportunity to government, to the alleged perpetrators, to actually, through a right to reply, to actually come forward with the questions that we have. So we do talk to all parties. But at the end of the day, the most important, I think, part of our mission is to ensure that victims of abuses and serious crimes receive justice and redress. So that's what I would like to say. The other thing I wanted to raise is that in terms of the standards that you raised, we're an international human rights organization, but when we look at our work on the African continent, we have to remember, and it's something that the Africa division has been very, I think, vocal about, is the fact that the African continent has some of the strongest legal instruments at the disposal of our leaders. We have an African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We have an African Court. We have a Constitutive Act of the African Union, which has a multiplicity of instruments and tools to actually tackle some of the worst crises that we're seeing right now. The question, I think, is why aren't these instruments deployed? And we go back to the essential issue of leadership, ethical leadership, and political will of African leaders. And that's an issue that keeps coming up, even as in our advocacy. Sorry, Namwaya, go ahead.
It's a question we get asked quite a lot by the police when we meet them. Why do you talk only about they say criminals have been killed and you don't talk about the police have been killed? Let me mention that the primary duty bearer for upholding and protecting human rights is usually government. And that is generally acknowledged. And the standard that government has for ensuring protection of human rights are the international standards that I mentioned and the national law. So the national law, the government has mechanisms which include the police for ensuring implementation of these standards. So when there is a failure on the implementation of the standards, we ask the primary duty bearer why the standards are not being implemented. And so if it's about life, the standard applies across the board, whether it is the police officer or a non-police officer, the standard applies across the board. So if the government is facing a situation where their police are being killed regularly, the question then will be whether there's a problem with the training, whether there's a problem with the way they're equipped. They're not equipped well enough to be able to protect themselves against the criminals.
So how do you answer police when they ask you, how come we never see you releasing statements when police officers are killed in the line of duty, or when police officers are facing all these, human rights abuses, or the way the state is treating its police is not good? How do you respond to them?
I think that question, if you look at the conversation Kenya has had for the last 10, 20 years, has centered around police reforms. And the issue of police reforms is basically about proper training of the police, the ensuring police are there to or follow the law, and proper equipping of the police, and ensuring basically the welfare of the police. That conversation around police reforms is actually a conversation around the same question that the police keep asking: why don't you talk about the police? When police get killed, the expectation is that that killing will be investigated the same way a killing of another person being investigated. And if you find the culprit behind the killing of the police officer, the process applies. Take them to court. Once they are convicted, they are found guilty, they are convicted.
I guess what we see is many times we see statements from Human Rights Watch and other rights advocacy organizations when citizens have died. When police officers are killed, say in Zamburu, there's an ambush, police officers have been killed. Similar statements don't come out to actually highlight the issues of maybe the plight of police officers, the welfare of these police officers, the equipping of these police officers, the state's responsibility of ensuring that its officers are properly facilitated to do their job. But let's take a break. We'll continue the conversation shortly. It's 26 minutes to 9. Yes, you will.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Our guests this morning are from Human Rights Watch. Otsieno Namwaya is the Director for East Africa at Human Rights Watch, and Karine Kaneza Nantulia is the Deputy Director for Africa. We're having a conversation about the state of human rights in Africa and in 2023. So, Otsieno, your question now. You can answer that.
Yeah, on the issue of why we issue statements out when other people are killed, but not when police are killed. I think that is not true. Normally, we say the responsibility to protect rests on the government. And that protection is actually a responsibility of the police. So when we see police being killed, our worry will be the government is not doing enough to protect its citizens. And those citizens include, when you see the police being killed, it tells you that there's a problem. And when we issue that kind of statement, we're expressing concerns about the lack of the government not doing enough to protect its citizens. Sometimes it is informed by the fact that police themselves, who are supposed to be protecting people, are actually being killed.
That is why I mentioned the issue of them being victims. Because here you are tasked with a Herculean issue, protecting the citizens of the country. Someone puts you in that position and they do not give you the wherewithal to ensure that that can actually be done. So, things go wrong. Anyone who puts a burden on you is putting a burden on your mind. And if that affects the way you think, we then start discussing mental health issues. That person, whatever else you say, is a victim.
But then who will you ask that question?
It will be the government. Directly.
The government, yes.
Exactly.
So, you cannot, for example, if Al-Shabaab have killed people in say, Nairobi, and that begins to affect the mental health issues of the police, you can't go to Al-Shabaab to ask them to address the problem. You have to go to the government to ask them to address the problem with the police.
I think you understand exactly where I'm going with my discussion.
Yes.
The other question that I wanted to ask is, when we discuss human rights, is with whose lens are we looking at human rights? Because there's also been this accusation, and of course I'm sure you'll deny it and you'll explain, that human rights organizations usually come with Western construct of human rights, and they talk about it from that angle, whether it's localized in terms of the localized perception of rights and application of those rights is done. So when we say human rights, are we talking about human rights? Yes, I know there is, the global uniform understanding of human rights, but at what point do those rights then become localized to local incidences and situations?
I think we ought to remember that when we talk about human rights in Africa, one of the earliest scriptures, actually, declarations, 12th, 13th century, came from Africa on human rights. So there is no such thing as a dichotomy or a discrepancy between the Universal Declaration of Rights and what and the history, the doctrine, the jurisprudence that Africa has produced over the years. But what we see in our line of work more often than not is that African leaders, non-state armed groups, will tend to hide actually behind this very argument that you just asked, that you've just raised, Eric, to shield themselves from scrutiny. So it's an easy debate, I think, for African human rights advocates to actually win. If we're going to talk about civil and political rights, because the other debate, I think, the other side of the coin is when people say, well, you focus more on civil and political rights and you don't talk about economic, social, and cultural rights. Well, let's talk about that and let's see what the work that we've done so far. And we've documented abuses committed by state and non-state owned companies in different countries. The massive displacement that has affected sections of communities, whether it's in Guinea or even in DR Congo, around extractive mining companies' work. But then the question, as Namwaya said before, who are the duty bearers? Whose responsibility is it to actually protect and ensure that communities have access to education, access to clean water, the right to development, which is another concept that African governments have really debated and talked about over the years. But whose responsibility is it to ensure all that? Who has actually ratified these legal tools that we're talking about, including the African Charter on Human Rights, on human and people's rights, which is an African instrument, but which is over and over again.
Almost similar to the Convention.
Absolutely, absolutely. Africa is the one continent where you have actually a right-based treaty just looking at the rights and the welfare of the child.
So what we're saying,
you don't have any other region that has that.
What we're saying essentially is that you have treaties that have been ratified by African governments.
Absolutely.
Number one, we are looking at a state whereby the abrogation of these rights has taken place in many African countries, but we report about them, but that we do not hold governments responsible to the point where something can actually be done. We hold governments responsible in talking about it and saying, look, this has not been done. Not enough of your children have gone to school. Not enough of your children have, proper food on the table. Not enough of your children are living in at least the minimum standard in terms of shelter. But we just talk about it. But with the ratification of these treaties, it means that you can actually hold people responsible should they go against what they have agreed in those treaties.
No, how do you hold them accountable?
This is exactly where I'm going. So what ought to be done when a country is flying in the face of something that they have ratified? They've ratified it, meaning that they will take the responsibility in the event that they don't do it right. But how do you do that? When a country will come and tell you, and we know this happens all the time, you've spoken about political will, you've spoken about political goodwill, when all the time they will tell you, okay, that's fantastic, but I'm struggling. My budgets don't allow me to do 1, 2, 3. We have many times when you're leaning on international donors to help you complete a fiscal budget. so that you can meet your overheads. And so now the question is, how do you hold governments responsible who are flying in the face of human rights, right? How do you do that? And say there are many reasons why they will give you. I want to talk. We're not talking about jailing people arbitrarily. We're not talking about executions. We're talking about basic food, shelter, education. How do you hold them responsible and say, well, you violated, and where are we taking you? Where are we taking them? What are we doing?
So sometimes the real impact of the kind of work that we do can take time, but eventually we do come to see the fruits of the work that we do. If you look at countries like Yugoslavia and the tribunal that was set up to investigate what was then the genocide there, a lot of the documentation was actually Human Rights Watch documentation. If you look at Rwanda in Africa and the genocide in Rwanda, whichever side one stands on, a lot of the documentation in Rwanda was actually Human Rights Watch documentation, and Human Rights Watch appeared at the Rwanda Tribunal in Arusha as expert witnesses because of the work they did, and the same with Yugoslavia. So when people get convicted because of the work that we did, and if that work informs judicial processes, then we consider that work well done. In Chad, one of our colleagues followed the Chad issues for like 10 years, and until last year. When the somebody actually got convicted, the person he had been tracking for a long time. In Kenya, 2014, 2015, 2016, if you remember, there were a lot of disappearances and extrajudicial killing in the name of fighting terrorism. And the most affected regions were northeastern coast, Nairobi, and maybe to some extent a few other places. And for some time it looked like the government was not listening. I think the only organization that ever went to nearly every other place where those things were happening, Mandera, we went to Mandera, we went to Wajir, we went to Garissa, we went to Lamu, we went to Malindi, we went everywhere. And in Nairobi, it was us. Ultimately, because of our work, we can say that at least 2016, 2017, the cases went down. And it looked like they had stopped 2018, 2019, when again they started. And a lot of times you may not know how much work goes in. Once we release the report, how much work goes in to ensure it stops. When we released the report, the first person we met was the then Inspector General of Police, who had denied that the police were involved at all. And we fleshed out to him specific cases where people were disappeared inside police stations. How can it be that police are not involved? Why can't you even investigate? And the matter went up. We had discussions in various meetings with different people and different partners. And eventually, the thing stopped. Our problem is that when it stopped, there was no attempt to ensure accountability and justice for the victims or families of victims. That's a conversation we still have. So what I'm trying to say is that you may not see the impact of our work immediately because some of those governments that we talk about can be very intransigent. But ultimately we have a lot of things that we can cite to show. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a few things. In completing what Namwaya just said, what he just said highlights the importance of having a vibrant civil society and an independent media. You have institutions that are essentially our partners as well. We work together. That's why you invited us today, right, to talk about this topic. And in parallel, that's why also there's a rise of authoritarianism on the continent as well, and the crackdown on, the media and the protesters and journalists and activists. I think as we go into 2023, we also have to remember that some of the violations that we've seen over the years, and especially in 2022, are a direct response, or rather a reflection of the resilience of some of these groups. The other point I would like to raise is the importance of maintaining and pushing, advocating for the independence of African human rights institutions like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So yes, on justice and accountability, it may take 10, 20, 15, 30 years. Some of the processes I've mentioned, as Namwaya said, happen partly because of the documentation that Human Rights Watch and other groups, including African civil society organizations on the ground, have kept and used in the advocacy. But we need to keep pushing to have an enabling policy and legal environment as we work on some of these outcomes.
From what I hear the two of you say, yes, progress is made by Human Rights Watch. Yes, progress is made by civil society organizations. But if I go back into history from the time the African countries, the countries within the African continent got independence, the group of people who seem to, with every successive change in leadership, who seem determined not to ensure that all these human rights activities that we've ratified and written about and enshrined in our laws are actually put in place are the political leadership. Would I be right in saying so? Because if you have the laws, if you have units and departments within government that are supposed to ensure these things get done, and yet it's a never ending, you have successes, but it never gets to the point where you really want to see it happen. So you're always, it's like a treadmill that you're always treading on. And yet leaders change. The leaders whom we had at independence are not the leaders we have now. And yet, yes, even with the changes and the positive results that we've received, we are still talking about the same things.
Ultimately, like I said, the responsibility rests with the state. The government is the primary duty bearer, and that's basically talking about political leadership. So you have to constantly engage the political leadership to ensure that if the right laws are in place and the right policies are in place, they basically enforce those policies. If they aren't, then they just make sure that they get the right laws and create the right policies.
Let me ask you an unfair
Can I
question.
just
Yes, please go ahead.
to try to answer your question? You said we're still talking about the same things, and I would like to push back a little bit on that. Are we really
Push
talking
back
about?
a great deal, please.
Are
Yes.
we talking about the same things? Because when you look at post-independence, the struggle for independence, the concept of human rights was actually forged and shaped within a certain language, which was political independence. That was achieved. Then you had, in the 90s, a whole period, a whole era, where really the discourse on the continent around human rights was really around the issue of how do we establish a constitutional democracy, get rid of military coups. We continued. Now, in 2020, let's say, and we had vicious conflict, including the genocide, including the rise of armed Islamist groups, right? So we are today looking at what we would call maybe the struggle for the institutionalization of human rights within the governance on many of these countries. And whether you look at, for instance, the resurgence, for instance, of military coups, which we've not talked about really today. What is at stake? What is at stake today is how the recruitment one of the factors that is at stake today is how the recruitment by armed Islamist groups is actually fueled by grievances about state failures to deliver basic services, but also because government forces commit atrocities. Those atrocities are compounded by extrajudicial killings, torture, questioning people sometimes on the basis of their ethnicity, and we're thinking here Mali, Burkina Faso, right? That is one pool of issues that were not necessarily the case, say, in the 80s. We were talking... So my point is that the discourse of human rights on the continent has never been static. It's always dynamic. One era gives way to another era and different set of issues.
Mm. And by the way, let me just make a clarification. When we have a conversation about human rights and ask governments to ensure that there's respect and protection of human rights, we don't mean that the violation will not occur. It will always occur. What matters is that when there's a violation, there's accountability. I think the biggest problem in Africa, and even Kenya here, is that we see things happening. The police are there, the mechanisms have been created, but nothing happens. The people get away with it. When you say that I think there has been, you alluded to it, that we assess African countries on different lenses, and then other places we assess on different lenses. In some of those countries, like I don't want to cite the US, but let me say some of those countries.
Allow me to say it for you. In the US.
Anyway, each of those countries have challenges. Huh? The difference is that when a violation occurs, there is a difference in the way in which they approach investigations and ensuring accountability. So, like today in Kenya, we will not be talking about the killings of up to 100 people that we documented in 2017. None of which have been investigated, apart from Baby Pendo and Stephanie Mora. I don't think we will say the same in some of the Scandinavian countries, for example. If 100 people died, it cannot just be swept under the carpet. There will be at least an attempt to investigate and ensure an accountability, even if it is not satisfactory. Yeah.
You know, I think this conversation, we've just barely scratched the surface. And it's important that, we have a continuation of this conversation in coming days as well, right? So we can look at greater depth. Yes, you mentioned, for example, the resurgence of military coups in West Africa. What's driving this, and what does it signify? Is it failure of states? Is it failure of accountability? Is it governments? Is it leadership? Is it the people being more woke? Or is it the military getting more... What exactly is happening? Maybe you have the answers to this, or you can give some light to that. But we thank you very much for joining us today. Come again soon.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having us.
Otsieno Namwaya is the Director for East Africa at Human Rights Watch, and Karine Kaneza Nantulia is the Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch for Africa. Asanteni sana for joining us, and welcome again soon.